Remember, it was the dot-com crash where we saw a very similar pattern, in fact, to this one that we're looking at right now. I think that the altcoin market collectively is basically about to enter the depression phase. By the way, if this does not hold, if these prior lows do not hold, then there's not really a whole lot of support.
Today I interview Quant Analyst Benjamin Cowen, and we discuss how the crypto market today, specifically altcoins, is eerily similar to the dot-com collapse of the early 2000s. Will any altcoins survive? Benjamin's picks may surprise you. We talk Ethereum, XRP, Binance, price prediction, and so much more. But first, Benjamin, what's your general take on the market?
Here's the altcoin market. And, I've sort of been under the impression that it's generally following net liquidity. And so as long as net liquidity is going lower, then so too likely is the altcoin market, right? If we were to overlay net liquidity onto this chart, we can generally see that as liquidity is taken out of the central banks, then the altcoin market tends to go down. And so I still have of that opinion that the altcoin market is likely going to continue to get hit until we get closer to a Fed pivot. Remember, it was the dot-com crash where we saw a very similar pattern, in fact, to this one that we're looking at right now with the altcoin market, right? So if you were to look at, let's say, like the 50-week moving average of the altcoin market, you can see that just like last cycle, right? Just like the NASDAQ out of the dot-com crash, we had sort of this double peak rejection out the 50-week, another sort of last hurrah at the 50-week, and then ultimately the NASDAQ went to go put in new lows, right? So I think the altcoin market will continue to bleed. Now, any given day, that doesn't mean that all altcoins are putting in new lows. Some of them are not. But even in the last couple of weeks, right, we saw Avalanche put in a new low. We saw Polkadot put in a new low. We saw Algorand put in a new low, right? So a lot of these altcoins do continue to go lower. Of course, they're not all going to put in new lows necessarily at the same time, but because there's this rotation of capital. But I think there's a good chance that this sort of plays out like what happened with the dot-com crash. And for for people who might not be familiar with the dot-com crash, just sort of put it in perspective and to sort of remind people of just how brutal it was, this is what the dot-com crash looked like. And you can kind of see a very similar pattern, right? Like do you remember that sort of that double top that we just talked about with the altcoin market and how it sort of came up to the 50-week and double topped and then got one last move up to the 50-week before rolling over and putting in these final lows, right? That's basically what the altcoin market looks like today, right? This sort of double top at the 50-week, another push to the 50-week on the news of the SEC versus Ripple case, right? Where everyone's like, all right, all the fundamentals are different. Now the altcoins are going to go up, only for it to just simply be another lower high. So I think that the altcoin market collectively is basically about to enter the depression phase, just like the NASDAQ entered the depression phase in 2002.
Benjamin, you have been very, very correct on altcoins bleeding against Bitcoin throughout the whole year. I got to give that to you because it's an unpopular thing to say. Altcoins are going to bleed, but that has happened. Where does this bottom? How long will this last?
Against Bitcoin?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a really cool chart actually that we can look at, and it's total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin.
And what is total 3 again?
So total 3 is basically the entire market, but you subtract out Bitcoin and ETH. So you're just looking at altcoins, okay? Because I don't really consider ETH and all. But this is the altcoin market. Take out USDT and then divide it out by Bitcoin, divided by Bitcoin's market cap, and you can see there's some beauty to it, right? The altcoin market tops out at parity with Bitcoin, right? When this ratio reaches 1, it tops out against Bitcoin. And I think that like last cycle, I think that it could find a low here around 25% of Bitcoin's market cap. Now, it did go lower during Bitcoin's parabolic rally, but it only lasted a few weeks. So I wouldn't put too much weight into sort of this move, although it could theoretically happen again. I would say that I'm still looking for the altcoin market to bleed down against Bitcoin. At this point, about another 47%. By the way, this is the same level that we saw altcoins rally last cycle, only to get rejected at around that same level, right? At the 20-week moving average, we saw the altcoin market as a percentage of Bitcoin's market cap rally up to around this level, only to get rejected and to come, capitulating down by the end of 2019. So I think that is what we're looking at. It could happen as early as the end of this year. Okay, so it could happen. I mean, it could happen anytime. I mean, it just depends on when the capitulation happens. I mean, you can see that once the capitulation started over here, it only lasted another month or two, right? So, I mean, by the time that I come on your channel in the future, right, whenever that is, it's possible that it's behind us, okay? But I still think it's ahead of us right now. I think that the altcoin market will likely continue to go down against Bitcoin. I know a lot of people are looking at the Bitcoin dominance right now, including stablecoins, right? And they're saying like it looks pretty bad, but I would still say it kind of just looks like it's retesting the breakout point, right, of 49%, sort of a retest of the breakout point, only to ultimately go higher. And if you look at things like the dominance excluding stable coins, it still just looks like a pretty bullish uptrend, right? Just higher lows and higher highs every step of the way. So my guess is that the earliest the altcoin market finally bottoms out against Bitcoin is by the end of the year. It could happen in Q3, right? But sometime over the next 3 to 4 months, I think is when there's at least a reasonable chance that it could happen.
Let's look at ETH, because ETH has separated itself from the altcoin pack a little. It's doing much better against Bitcoin compared to the other altcoins. What are your next price targets for ETH?
So for the Ether Bitcoin pair, I've been bearish on it pretty vocally, really since 2022. Was actually at this move here is kind of where I switched my thesis on it, because the first video on my channel is actually on the Ether Bitcoin pair, and it was in September of 2019, and I said Ether Bitcoin is very undervalued at at 0.017 or whatever it was at. But over here, I did not flip bearish on Ether Bitcoin at the top, right? Like I didn't. It took me really until about late Q1 of 2022 to sort of say that Ether Bitcoin will likely bleed. And since then, it dropped, it then came back up, sort of swept these prior highs. Ever since then, it's just been a slow bleed. So it is true that Ether Bitcoin has been holding up incredibly well, especially compared to the altcoin market, right? I mean, it's a fact that it has been holding up a lot better. With that said, it still is a series of lower highs and lower lows, especially ever since the merge. We went into the merge and a lot of people said it was going to be a game changer for the Ether Bitcoin pair, and they were calling for, sort of the flippening and whatnot. But ever since then, if the tokenomics really were going to change a whole lot, why has it still been a lower high after another, right? One lower high after another and a lower low after another. So I still think that the Ether Bitcoin valuation is in a massive distribution phase, just like we saw last cycle, right? So if you were to look at let's pull up monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. I mean, every single monthly Heikin-Ashi candle for 2023 has been red. I mean, this is January 2023. It's just been bleeding for basically the entire year. I still think, and I think I've said this every time I've come on your channel for a while now, but I think that we're just in this distribution phase again, just like we were over here. And I do think that this drop by the Ether Bitcoin pair, when it finally does capitulate down here, I think it's going to go to around 0.03 to 0.04. That might mark the end of the altcoin reckoning. So like that could be the when altcoins finally bottom out on their Bitcoin pairs, is whenever the Ether Bitcoin valuation finally takes the plunge.
And by the way, maybe a reason that ETH is holding up better than others is because the tokenomics did change with the recent updates. It has had many deflationary days, or way less supply into the market compared to other years. Right. So maybe we don't see those lows because of that change. It's
possible. Yeah, I mean, it's completely possible. I still would point towards it's still technically lower highs and lower lows, right? I mean, it's possible that it affected how quick the event was going to happen, right? Maybe it slowed it down, and maybe at the end of the day, it's not as bad as I think, right? There's always a chance that has happened, but it has not changed the fact that Ether Bitcoin is bleeding, right? It still is bleeding from those highs, and it's been a very slow and painful bleed. Another thing to look at, by the way, is the Ether dominance. And I don't think I've shown this one on your channel, but you know how a lot of people look at Bitcoin dominance and they say that it's lower highs over the macro scale, right? Like if you were to draw this channel here, you could say that it's been lower highs, but it's also been higher lows, right? I almost wonder if Ethereum dominance is doing the same thing, and it's just so early to know yet, where it's also putting in lower highs and also potentially putting in higher lows. But if you look at the Ethereum dominance, it was red in June, it was red in July, it was red in August. It is a concerning trend. I mean, it is slowly going down. So I think it's worthwhile to take note of that. Last year when it dropped, by the way, it dropped really, really quickly, and it went all the way down to around 14% or so. I still think there's a good chance that we see that and actually go lower than that. But I don't think Ethereum dominance is ever going to go back to where it was in September 2019, right? I think it's like, well, ever is a strong word, right? I don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now, but I think like at least in the coming cycle, I don't really see the Ethereum dominance going much lower than 10%.
Let's move on to some lower cap altcoins, but fun question for you, Ben. If Bitcoin hits that coveted 100K next cycle, is there any chart you have that can show us maybe a range for ETH?
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably just look at the ratio, right? I mean, if ETH or Bitcoin is putting in lower highs, I mean, sort of an inconvenient truth, but it is. I mean, it has been putting in lower highs from one cycle to another. I mean, this was that way back over here. It was at 0.15, then 0.12, then 0.08 or 0.09, close to 0.09, and then around 0.085. I suppose if you maybe just multiply the ratio, right? If you say that if Bitcoin hits 100K and Ether Bitcoin goes to say 0.07, then you're looking at a $7,000 ETH, right? So I mean, it really just depends on sort of the nature of the ratio. If what you mentioned earlier, it turns out to be correct, and that the tokenomics, the sort of the deflationary aspect if it does keep ETH from that capitulation, then perhaps it can go to a higher ratio. I think that there is a chance that Ether Bitcoin's ratio could theoretically take out these prior highs over here. But I think that if it does that, it still likely goes down first and then back up. So that's kind of where I stand. So I would just look at the Ether Bitcoin ratio, multiply that by the price of Bitcoin USD at the peak, and just say, pick out your most optimistic Ether Bitcoin ratio, and then figure out what the price of Ether would be.
We had strong community feedback. People in our last video commenting down below. I want you to talk about XRP. I want you to talk about Binance, BNB token. Could we look at some of those charts?
Yeah. So if you look at XRP Bitcoin, and again, it's always worthwhile to try to remain objective about this stuff. XRP's Bitcoin valuation seems to mostly be an oscillator, right? Like it hasn't really gone well above these prior highs. It hasn't really taken out these prior lows. It seems to oscillate within a fairly well-defined range. At least that's what we've seen so far. So until proven otherwise, I would probably just assume that it will remain an oscillator. That doesn't mean that it will always be one, but that is what I would generally expect. The thing to look for is when an altcoin is putting in higher lows or holding its lows on its Bitcoin pair in a Bitcoin USD downtrend, then that tends to bode well for that altcoin in a future Bitcoin bull run, right? So like think about last cycle. We saw Link Bitcoin putting in higher lows in 2019, and then it did really, really well in 2020. Even though Link USD took a big hit when we had that recession in March of 2020, it was putting in those higher lows. So I'm still looking at sort of this XRP Bitcoin valuation. Can it hold these higher lows here, or does it capitulate down? If you look, by the way, at XRP USD, one of the things you might note, and I was actually talking about this earlier today on a different stream, is that, and again, I mean, it depends on it. Maybe I should switch this over to a sort of a regular scale here. But when you look at it, it was sort of trying to hold these lows over here in 2019 as well on its USD pair. And then it ultimately capitulated down, right? So it was holding these lows, and then in Q3 of the pre-halving year, so in August, September, you can see that XRP USD sort of capitulated down, and then it kept going back up to this prior level and kept holding it as resistance. So in the short term, I would say because Bitcoin is I think bearish right now, I think we're likely going to look at XRP fading back to 40 cents at the very least, is my guess, at the very least. And if it can hold that level, then that's that's at least somewhat optimistic. If it can't hold that level, then I think you're probably looking at another 30 to 40% drop below that. So in the short term, on its USD pair, I still am bearish on it because it's an altcoin, and I just think that altcoins are going to get hit pretty hard, especially going into the end of the year. On its Bitcoin pair, it is more optimistic, but I don't think that will be reflected on its USD pair until sometime in late 2024.
Does the positive legal regulatory news that XRP had, does that change your outlook at all? Because XRP is in a slightly different place than it was all those years prior.
I mean, it makes me more bullish on the altcoin market over the long haul. I mean, I think a lot of people mistake me for a Bitcoin maxi just because I've been bearish on the altcoin market for like the last 20 months. But it's more like, hey guys, I got wrecked last cycle quite badly because I thought that the altcoin market was going to go up, and it just kept going down, and it kept putting in new lows. Even in the halving year, a lot of these altcoins put in new lows. I mean, look at XRP, right? In 2019, it was putting in new lows. In 2020, it was putting in new lows. And this is well after Bitcoin bottomed, and Bitcoin bottomed in December of 2018, and XRP was continuing to put in new lows. So I mean, I would say that it's definitely a win for crypto that Ripple won, right? I think it's certainly a win for crypto. But as I said, I made a video on the day that it came out and alts were rallying, and I said back then, guys, the narratives don't really mean a whole lot because they can lead to price movement in a day, right? I mean, it can lead to a rally or a dump in a single day, depending on the news, but it all comes back to liquidity. And at the end of the day, right, it was a very bullish thing that Ripple won, but we also saw XRP completely retrace the entirety of those gains. So in that sense, it should show people that altcoins are more so a function of excess liquidity than they are of whatever the most prevailing narrative is at the time. I think those narratives are important, and they'll play a role, but they're only going to play a role once the liquidity comes back, and that's only going to happen on the other side of a Fed pivot.
And very quickly, BNB token, next price targets.
Yeah, so BNB Bitcoin is an interesting one because it's been slowly going down. And by the way, this is one that can also impact the dominance of Bitcoin a lot because the BNB market cap is relative, it's higher than a lot of the altcoins. To me, this just looks like sort of the prior trends, right? Where it just sort of slowly trends up before finding the next breakdown point. That you have to be careful with these things because eventually that trend will break, just like it did with Bitcoin USD in prior cycles. But until proven otherwise, I guess I just assume that it ultimately will sort of break to the downside. If you look at BNB Bitcoin last cycle, you can kind of see that the sort of these lows that it had in sort of the bear market year, it did eventually go below that. It took until the halving year or even the post-halving year to do it, but I think you're likely going to, at the very least, see something similar where BNB Bitcoin, goes below 7,000 Satoshis. I'm not saying that it's going to go all the way back down here, but I think there is a case to be made that eventually it will roll over and sort of take out the prior low from October of 2021 and probably take out this low from June of 2020. And if you look at, and by the way, I mean, BNB Bitcoin has just been putting in, I mean, it's been fading a lot really ever since the end of 2022. If you look at BNB USD, I mean, it just sort of looks like it's wanting to potentially go retest at the very least this prior wick over here, right? Like around 180. And maybe that'll hold. If by the way, if this does not hold, if these prior lows do not hold, then there's not really a whole lot of support. I mean, I think a lot of people forget just how quickly a lot of these altcoins moved up, and they can also move down quickly as well, right? So like if this does not hold at like 180, then all of a sudden there's like not a whole lot of support for a long time. And this move here, by the way, if you think about this, if it retraces even half of that move, that's how you see the Bitcoin dominance go up a lot, right? I'm not saying that dominance has to go to 75% or 72% like it was last cycle, but that's how you get to 60% dominance as you look at these altcoins and they take out these prior support levels that a lot of people think they can't break. I think it probably will break it eventually. I think it'll likely break below it into a recession, and then the Fed will print, and then maybe they'll go back up. But that's where I currently stand on BNB.
If you had to buy altcoins today, 3, not ETH, if we were at a bottom, what altcoins would you be interested in? What makes you tick, Benjamin?
So I think you just look at their Bitcoin pairs. I mean, it's all about their Bitcoin. It's do they hold their lows in a Bitcoin USD downtrend, right? So you look at, if you were to go look at like ADA Bitcoin or Solana Bitcoin or Polkadot or Avalanche, whatever, you just look at their Bitcoin pairs and, just sort of go through a few of them, right? Like look at Dot Bitcoin. Is it holding its lows on its Bitcoin pair? Has it at all? Really? Since May of 2021? It hasn't. I mean, every time people think it maybe has, you just give it a few more months and it goes lower. So if these sorts of tokens, right, like if Bitcoin can hold these lows, then it becomes interesting in a Bitcoin USD downtrend. So like imagine Bitcoin sort of fades back to 20K or 18K or something like that. If Bitcoin can hold these lows, then that becomes sort of a bullish sign that once Bitcoin turns back up, that altcoin will explode back up to the upside. If on the other hand, we just wait a couple more months and this keeps going down, then it's just simply not there, right? Look at Sol Bitcoin. You know, it's been trying to hold these lows here at around 4,000 to 5,000 sats, and it held it here. I mean, it put it in December 2022, and then retested it in June of 2023. If it comes back down and tests it again, and it's just a wick at 4,000 to 5,000 sats in a Bitcoin USD downtrend, then that's probably a bullish sign, right? So it all comes back to, does it hold its low in a Bitcoin USD downtrend? And a lot of these, we just haven't had enough time to know if they're going to or not. Like ADA Bitcoin, will 800 sats hold? I have my doubts. Like I really do have my doubts that it'll hold. I think it's more likely to hold at like 400 sats. So I mean, I'm not going to go out. You know, I'm not going out today to buy altcoins because I still think they are very risky. And I will say that if they have bottomed on their Bitcoin pairs, which still remains to be proven, they're still likely to go down on their USD pairs. Even ADA Bitcoin, if you remember, it bottomed here on its Bitcoin pair in August of 2019, but it kept going lower on its USD pair until March of 2020, right? It still kept going lower because Bitcoin was in a downtrend on its USD pair. So I think that's what you look for. And it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't, you don't marry a single altcoin. It doesn't matter, necessarily what the ticker is. It does it hold its low on its Bitcoin pair or not. And if it does, then that bodes well for the next cycle. And if it doesn't, then it says it's likely going to be a relic of a prior cycle and no one's going to care about it next cycle.
Love that perspective. Benjamin, thank you for joining me. I want to have you back in 1, 2, 3, a couple months. We're going to revisit these charts, but final thoughts for the Altcoin Daily community.
Yeah, final thoughts I would say is, what I tend to say with the altcoin market is that, they tend to bleed further than everyone thinks in the, in the bear market year and the pre-halving year, but they also tend to come back aggressively, sort of the middle part of the halving year and the post-halving year. So just remember that where we are right now is actually more or less identical to where we were 4 years ago. And what we saw back then was a continued bleed until the end of the year and then a rally into a recession. We could see the same exact thing. So just remember, if and when a recession comes, that's when the Fed will likely print. And when the Fed prints, that's when liquidity returns. And that's when the altcoin market starts to do well again.